Trump is very unpredictable in some respects, but there are other respects in which he's absolutely rock solid dependable, and that is, of course, doing whatever Russia wants. The calculation for the Kremlin has to be how far can they push before it becomes so embarrassing that even Donald Trump has to rein in and not give them what they want. So many things that are up in the air. What we have to hope is that behind the scenes there have been serious and sensible conversations about what is in fact possible in terms of preserving or imposing peace in Ukraine without support from the United States and without agreement from Russia. Because if any force goes into Ukraine and is then attacked by Russia, which it inevitably will be because Russia will probe and test, and then pulls out instead of responding robustly, that's worse than not having gone on in the first place.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm Louis Sykes. Today we're joined by Keir Giles, who is a Russia expert at Chatham House and author of many books on geopolitics, including Who Will Defend Europe? Keir, thank you very much for joining us today.
Hello, Louis.
Well, I wanted to start with Trump's pretty harsh words for Putin over the weekend. In fact, I think that's probably the first time an American president has publicly used the words pissed off when referring to Vladimir Putin. How does the Kremlin react to this sort of threat?
Well, there are a lot of things that Donald Trump has said that no American president has said before, and I think on the scale of things, that's probably fairly minor. We should also be concerned about his planning to run for a third term, with or without changes to the Constitution, following, of course, Vladimir Putin, Alexander Lukashenko, all of those other great statesmen that have decided that 2 terms are not enough, and they will wangle the Constitution to stay in. But this isn't the first time that Trump has been supposedly harsh, at least in words, towards Putin. There have been 2 previous occasions where there has been a threat from Trump that there'll be some kind of economic consequence for Russia if Russia doesn't fall in line with his beautiful peace plan. The problem is they are fleeting aberrations. They're fleeting deviations from the normal default, which is putting all of the pressure on Ukraine, coercing Ukraine into a peace agreement while simply inviting Russia. So from the Kremlin's point of view, they can probably sit back and relax and think that this will be just another blip. It's going to be a passing phase, and they'll soon be back on track with demanding whatever they want from the United States.
And so there's no worry in the Kremlin about this kind of unpredictability, which has really shaken up the rest of Europe in the last few months.
Well, the unpredictability, of course, is partial. It's not total. Trump is very unpredictable in some respects, but there are other respects in which he's absolutely rock solid dependable, and that is, of course, doing whatever Russia wants. The calculation for the Kremlin has to be how far can they push before it becomes so embarrassing that even Donald Trump has to rein in and not give them what they want. And that, of course, will be something they're watching for very closely. They'll be looking at messages like these and waiting for the first indication that it is actually genuine and it is meant. Otherwise, they can just continue on as they like.
So Trump also added to some of these comments this idea that he wants something in the next month. We also know that they've already put in this idea of a 100-day limit on how quickly they want to get some sort of ceasefire in Ukraine. I mean, are the Russians listening to any of that, or are they just waiting to see if Trump's actually willing to take action?
Well, let's not forget that the 100-day limit was at one point a 24-hour limit. So the Russians could well anticipate that actually, yes, this will stretch if you push it far enough. This isn't the first mention of tariffs, taxes, and sanctions, which was the first threat that Trump put in place on Russia. But again, until it is actually acted on or becomes a consistent policy as opposed to just a random tweet, then I think the Russians can be fairly relaxed.
And, I was speaking to a former Ukrainian soldier yesterday who's now a commentator on this conflict. His take on this really was, we'll believe it when we see it. Is there any sign of action from the Trump regime that is actually going to tighten the screws on Putin?
It's not visible now. It hasn't been visible throughout the whole of this process. Instead, the only people that are having the screws tightened on them, the only people that are getting screwed, are the Ukrainians, as ever.
Well, I want to come on to that. I mean, there have been some harsh words for President Zelensky as well. Trump has said he mustn't back out of the minerals deal that effectively hands over Ukraine's mineral resources to the US until it pays them back, as Trump sees it, for the military support they've been given so far. Is there any reason now for Zelensky to sign that minerals deal?
We really shouldn't be calling it a minerals deal. Not only because of the fact that it has not been signed, it has not been agreed, there's nothing for Zelensky to back out of, it is simply a proposal, but also because a deal, the language suggests that it's some kind of mutually beneficial arrangement. This is a deal in the same way that a mugging is a deal. Hand me your wallet and your phone and I will not knife you. That's the only way in which this can be described as a deal that actually meets both parties' interests. Ukraine doesn't get knifed. Plus, of course, the terms on which this is being set up are even more harsh than the first iterations of this agreement that we saw. Now that the aid that the United States provided to Ukraine, without specifying that it would be a loan, it was supposed to be for Ukraine to support itself because that was in the US's best interests, now being declared something that Ukraine has to pay back, in effect, reparations for being invaded. The problem is that once you put sufficient pressure on Ukraine, both from the Russian and from the United States side, there will come a point at which the demands of Russia and the US are worse than fighting on without US support. And what Trump risks, of course, is getting to the point where he is pulling too much out of Ukraine, and Ukraine, in effect, cuts the Americans loose instead of the other way around.
Well, I want to come back just briefly to what Trump could do about Russia. I mean, on the other side of this, whether or not we believe Trump is willing to put sanctions on Russia, on Putin, does the Kremlin at this point really care about sanctions from the US? I mean, yes, Russia's economy is struggling, it's widely recognized, but they are well practiced at avoiding sanctions. And there is also this argument that paradoxically, if you sanction Russia more or Russian oil more, you just end up driving the price of that Russian oil up. And it doesn't have a massive economic effect. So are the Russians really going to be worried about more sanctions being put on their oil?
Well, let's put this in context again. There is the suggestion that sanctions or tariffs would be imposed on Russia, but all of the conversation to date has been about lifting sanctions on Russia as part of the process of rehabilitating Russia, rewarding it for its aggression by bringing it back into the club of nations that the United States wants to work in partnership with, while excluding those that have been its long-standing friends, partners, and allies. So the Russians might well be worried that that prospect of sanctions relief, because after all this is something they've been working towards consistently since sanctions were first imposed, might be threatened. But I don't think they take realistically the idea that they could be hurt by further additional sanctions, even if Trump were willing to impose them.
And the idea of these sanctions, of course, though, is that it's not Russia necessarily that faces the full force of them. It's nations buying Russian oil. I mean, is there an argument there that, if you perhaps put tighter sanctions on countries like India or China, that could have an impact on their support for Russia?
Well, that's one aspect where there is a certain amount of unpredictability from the Trump-Musk regime in the United States, because torpedoing their existing relationships with countries that had been friendly disposed towards them and undermining all of those international relationships that kept not just Europe, but actually the United States itself prosperous and secure is something they have seemed plainly willing to do. But to the extent that that would, by extension, harm Russia, it seems an unlikely course of action for a US administration that seems determined not to do that.
And there's been firmer support from European allies for Kyiv. The UK and France last week announcing military planners would go to Ukraine to begin work on this idea of a reassurance force. Are Europe doing enough?
Well, first of all, thank God nobody's calling it a peacekeeping force anymore. And this slightly mealy-mouthed term that's been dreamt up to replace it is not great, but it's certainly better than giving people the idea that this might be a lightly armed blue helmet force that would not be able to withstand the first Russian attack. But there are still so many questions that are unanswered about what exactly this force might look like. And to some extent, that's not surprising. We don't know what the mission is going to be because we don't know what the state of a peace agreement is going to be. And we don't hear anybody thinking about inserting themselves into Ukraine in order to bring about a peace agreement. So a lot of questions up in the air, but still the basic conditions for this force that are still being discussed at the moment are things that are never going to happen. We hear that it can't operate without US support, and the United States has said there's never going to be US support. We hear talk about the Russians agreeing to it, and of course the Russians are never going to acquiesce in this because the whole purpose of this force being there is to frustrate Russia. So many things that are up in the air. What we have to hope is that behind the scenes there have been serious and sensible conversations about what is in fact possible in terms of preserving or imposing peace in Ukraine without support from the United States and without agreement from Russia. Because if any force goes into Ukraine and is then attacked by Russia, which it inevitably will be because Russia will probe and test, and then pulls out instead of responding robustly, that's worse than not having gone on in the first place.
So is there any sign that Europe is willing to go this alone effectively, send these troops in, at least in, say, a training capacity, or is it entirely reliant on the Americans giving some sort of backing to this force?
At the moment, we simply can't tell. What we have to hope is that over the last weeks and months, there's been a process of inventorizing military capacity across Europe to see what can be done without the Americans. And, of course, that is going to be the basis for any force that can go into Ukraine. Without the Americans and protecting yourself against the Russians. That's a tall order for European militaries that can only deploy a relatively tiny proportion of their fighting strength. But then, of course, you have to ask the question, if you can't deploy forces, if you can't project power onto your own continent and expect it to survive if Russia doesn't want it to be there, then what exactly are Europe's armed forces for? If they can't meet the very basic political mission of frustrating Russia when it's trying to invade somewhere, what are they for?
Well, as we mentioned at the start of this interview, your book posits this question: who will defend Europe? Is the answer now then Britain and France?
It certainly looks as though Britain and France would like people to think that that is the answer. But all of the problems that were identified in that book, which came out in October 2024, effectively described the situation that we're in now with Russian determination and American disengagement and Western European denialism combining into this perfect storm of a challenge from Russia we can't meet. All of that is still there. And the deficiencies of Western European armed forces are still there because there has not been the program of crash rearmament and investment in defense that we've seen from the easternmost countries. So for the time being, the answer that I suggested in the book, that it is the frontline states that have taken their military and their civil and their societal defenses seriously, that are still the next line of defense of Europe after Ukraine.
Would you judge at this point that Russia, or the geopolitical situation we found ourselves in, has led to a decoupling of America from the rest of Europe and therefore NATO?
Let's not be too hasty to say what in fact has been decoupled, because there are so many elements of the security relationship between the United States and Europe that are so far untouched by the Trump-Musk wrecking ball. Now, the question is the longer-term intent to do the same to them as they've done to other levers of US power abroad, like USAID, like RFE-RL? Is it simply that they haven't got around to it yet? Or do we believe the assurances of some people within the United States administration that the commitment to NATO, to Article 5, remains untouched? We have to wait and see, once again, by what exactly is done rather than what is being said.
And is the, at least so far, less firm stance of America alongside NATO, is that going to be something that Putin will be judging to be a positive thing for Russia yet? Or will a lot of this bolstering statements about defence, statements about facing down the Russian threat from European nations, actually something that he should be worried about?
Well, obviously, Russia will have been celebrating throughout this period. They're probably getting quite tired of all the winning and all the celebrating at this point. They know, just as well as European countries do, how the backbone of European defense has been the United States. So if the United States is not willing to take part in European defense, Russia can have a very much easier time of it. For all of the NATO contingents that have been deployed forward into the frontline states, the NATO enhanced forward presence, the multinational battalions in, for example, the 3 Baltic states and Poland, it is the presence of United States forces that has always been the gold standard of ensuring security, because the one thing Russia has not wanted to do is challenge the United States, because they knew that would be a very one-sided contest. Now that they don't need to challenge the United States because the US is giving every indication of walking away and letting Russia in, of course, it makes the job of planners in the Kremlin very much easier. And it comes back to the whole purpose of NATO, in that old catchphrase about NATO was set up to keep the Russians out, the Americans in, and the Germans down. Now, of course, what Trump wants and what Putin wants is to keep the Russians in, the Americans out, and the Germans irrelevant.
Well, meanwhile, in the actual hot war that is going on in Ukraine, Russia has intensified its air campaign on major Ukrainian cities in recent days. Both sides are claiming that the other is violating this idea of an energy infrastructure ceasefire, but Putin's not signed up to that. I mean, he's voiced an idea that he would be willing to do this and then added conditions. So why is Russia using this idea of a ceasefire to criticize Kiev if it doesn't really agree to one in the first place itself?
Well, that's suggesting that when Russia accuses somebody of doing something, it's based on some kind of fact or logic. There's no reason to think that just because you haven't had signed a ceasefire doesn't mean you can't accuse somebody else of violating it, because that version, that story, will be picked up, for example, in the United States. So if you accuse Ukraine of doing something and you have a credulous audience in Washington, D.C., of course it increases your leverage, it improves your position. And meanwhile, of course, Russia can string the process out for as long as it likes, because there's no point signing up to a ceasefire if you think you're in a militarily advantageous position, and if you think that at any moment Ukraine might once again have its intelligence support and its military aid from the United States cut off again.
Is there any sign then that Russia is willing to come to the table on a ceasefire, or are they just using all the old tricks that we've heard a lot of in the last few years to just string the Americans out?
For long-term Russia watchers like me, all of this is very, very warily familiar. Right from the ceasefire process itself, because we have seen so many times how ceasefires on Russian terms have been imposed on the victims of Russian aggression by third parties. It happened in Georgia, it happened in Syria, it happened in Ukraine itself under the Minsk agreements. So that whole construct, of course, is something that a lot of Russia watchers were warning against for a long time, but Ukraine has been strong-armed into it. Now, Russia will engage with it when it feels that there's something to be gained from it, when it profits more from freezing the conflict than from actually pushing forward as hard as they can.
And elsewhere on the front in the conflict in Ukraine, in fact in Russia, we've seen that the Russian forces have had this success in largely pushing the Ukrainians out of Kursk. There is now some sort of operation going on in Belgorod, but it's not really clear the extent to which that is, a larger operation or just a reaction to what is going on in Kursk. I mean, is there a sign that the Russians really do feel emboldened by these talks so far?
Well, they certainly should feel emboldened by the talks so far, because the consistent pattern is giving Russia what it wants. So for as long as Russia can string the United States along while pushing home its military advantage, of course, it makes sense for them to do that. And it's true, there is often a lag in what we understand is happening on the front line in Ukraine. If we think back to the very beginnings of the Kursk offensive in August of last year, a lot of people simply didn't know what was going on, not only who was where, but what it was all for. We might see a similar situation evolving now on the front line today.
And meanwhile, Kiev and some of their allies are reportedly starting to push forward the idea that the Russians might be willing to actually go back on the offensive as we head towards summer and try and take more land just before some sort of ceasefire is agreed. How much room do the Russians have to do that on the international stage? And is that a realistic threat at this point, do you think?
Well, Russia would ordinarily be preparing for an offensive to capture more land. So at the present moment, as things are going with the notional ceasefire, why would they stop? Once again, if they can push forward for military advantage while waiting for Trump finally to realize that this ceasefire is not going to happen, then of course they will do so.
But should Putin be worried now that Trump, as he said at least over the last few days, is not on board with this idea of getting rid of Zelensky ahead of any sort of ceasefire?
Russia's ultimate goal, of course, is for Ukraine to be erased from the map, and regime change is just a step towards that. So obviously it will be a bonus if the United States can be co-opted into delivering one of those outcomes for Russia, but it's only a step along the way. What we shouldn't lose sight of is the ultimate goal of Russia.
You talk about that overall aim of the Kremlin in this conflict. Can you just take us back through what those aims are and how close is Putin to achieving that?
Well, let's think back to what Putin explained were the purposes of this invasion of Ukraine when he was talking to Russians on television the night before. He said he wanted to reverse the historic strategic mistakes of 100 years ago when the early Bolsheviks setting up the USSR laid down the lines on the map that we now think are the borders of Eastern Europe, and the first target for that was Ukraine. He wants to revise those borders so that those countries he says are not real countries are once again under Moscow's domination. Now, the problem for us, of course, is that affects not just Ukraine, but also countries that are full-fledged members of the EU and NATO, to which we and the UK have treaty obligations.
And, what could Putin say he's achieved in this war at this point then? I mean, he might be facing the end of the conflict or at least some sort of pause to it. What is he missing now that could secure his position, at least from inside challengers?
Well, Putin can claim whatever he wants in this conflict. When you have the luxury of almost complete control of what comes out through state media within the Russian Federation, and most Russians choosing to believe what they see on state media, then you can claim victory at any point. But after all, think back to the original aims that were stated, the denazification, the demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, you can claim it's been denazified at any point because there were never any Nazis there to begin with. You can claim it's been demilitarized if you have eliminated a significant portion of the Ukrainian armed forces, especially after they stop receiving support from the United States. Any of those objectives can be declared as being met at any time when Putin chooses to freeze the conflict. But, of course, a frozen conflict in Ukraine simply means that Russia's forces are free to rebuild even faster without Ukraine destroying them almost as fast as that happens. And they're also free to choose other targets in Europe at a time of their choice.
And is there a sign in what European leaders have been saying in the past week that Europe is able to rebuild faster than the Russians could?
No, it's been quite the opposite. We are not hearing anything now that is different from previous months and the last couple of years of this conflict, where the forecasts for how rapidly Russia would be ready to challenge a NATO member state are very, very much less than it would take Europe to actually be ready to meet the challenge.
So I get the sense from this interview then that in your mind, the only thing that is really stopping Putin in a solid way from ending this conflict is his own ambition.
Well, yes, the conflict can be ended at any time. Donald Trump's described himself as the only person that can end the war. That's not true. It's Vladimir Putin. At any point, you can say, oh, enough, we're stopping attacking Ukraine.
Well, Keir Giles, thank you very much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you.
You've been watching Frontline for Times Radio with me, Louis Sykes. If you'd like to be the first to get exclusive content, you can sign up for membership with the link below. You can also listen to Times Radio for the latest news and analysis, or read it on thetimes.com. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.